I'm Enrico Gruen, and this week on Second Nature, the magical world of subatomic particles with supercolliding, superconducting particle accelerators. And the evening meal was ready, and he was expected. And Rose drew him in and set him in his chair and put little Eleanor upon his lap. He drew a deep breath. "Well, I'm back," he said. So ends a fantasy epic that was conceived in the 1920s and 30s, written in the 40s, published in the 50s, and a bestseller since the 60s. Greetings, prisoners of gravity. This is Commander Rick. Let's celebrate J.R.R. Tolkien's timeless tale of good versus evil, of swords and sorcery, of friends and foes and fellowship and faith, The Lord of the Rings.
Rising anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe has voted English-only sign. 40,000 tons of armed with PCBs blew up the ozone layer today.
Standing by for solid rocket booster separation.
Around the time of World War I, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was a student of philology, the study of linguistic origins. In his spare time, he invented a medieval language for elves, which he called Elvish. Later, as a professor of medieval literature, he created a mythology and a culture to support Elvish. Finally, in 1937, Tolkien published a children's story, The Hobbit, set in his mythical, magical world of Middle-earth. Here, Bilbo Baggins, one of the cozy rural hobbits, falls into adventures with elves, trolls, dwarves, wizards, and humans. Then Tolkien took 13 years to write what he called a really long story that would hold the attention of readers, amuse them, delight them, and at times excite or deeply move them. When it was published in 3 parts in the mid-50s, The Lord of the Rings hardly moved anyone. But in the 60s came a paperback edition, and hundreds of thousands of readers fell under the spell of the story of Bilbo's young cousin Frodo, who, at the behest of the wizard Gandalf, forms a fellowship of adventurers determined to destroy a sacred and powerful ring to prevent it from falling back into the hands of the evil Sauron and his dark riders. The Lord of the Rings trilogy has profoundly affected readers and other fantasists. It has inspired computer games and role-playing games. It has influenced filmmakers like George Lucas with his Star Wars trilogy, musicians, check out Led Zeppelin 4, and of course, comic book creators.
One of my central influences creatively has been The Lord of the Rings. I read that when I was a freshman in college. Just before it came out in paperback, my English teacher, William E. Coles, my second semester English teacher, loaned me his 3 volumes of the hardcover, and I took those home and read them. And that, as much as you can when you're at my advanced age, is probably my favorite book. I mean, you go through times, oh, yes, blue is my favorite color, this is my favorite book, this is my favorite this. When you get older eventually, well, I like blue here, but I may like green over here. You're not quite as locked into that stuff. But The Lord of the Rings may be my favorite book. I mean, probably still, certainly one of my very favorites, and very influential on my thinking about how I tell stories, and probably the kind of stories that I like to tell myself, and the way I tell them.
You can really see Tolkien's influence on comics in the handful of titles that chronicle the adventures of elves. There's Doug Minch and Mike Ploog's Weird World, Barry Blair's Elflord, and the ever-popular Elf Quest. Elf Quest was one of the first alternative comics when it was created by Wendy and Richard Pini back in the 70s, and now it's enjoying a revival as Elf Quest New Blood. But Tolkien's influence in comics runs a lot deeper than just these few titles. Charles, what sort of influence has Tolkien had on your work?
Oh, monumental influence. I first read Tolkien when the first paperback books were coming out, and you had to wait a month between each saga. Now, at the time, I was probably getting 50 cents a month for allowance. I couldn't afford it, and I talked my mom into buying the first one. Then I had to wait 3 months between the first volume and the second volume till Christmas came around, and different people in the family bought them, and then they didn't see me for a week because I went into a hole somewhere and read them, and reread them every year or so for the next about 10 years. And all that imagery was just, it was a real and living world, and it was wonderful, and I don't think I've matured enough as an artist yet to draw it. I've tried it a couple times, but it's very imposing.
Actually, there's never been a Lord of the Rings comic because the Tolkien estate keeps a real tight rein on the rings. So only a few comic book artists have had the chance to try their hand on Tolkien's magical landscape. Michael Kaluta was the first comic artist to get to draw the Tolkien calendar, and it was a dream come true for him. Some of the images are based on sketches Mike did over 15 years ago. David Wenzel did a 3-issue adaptation of The Hobbit for Eclipse Comics, and a while back I talked to Mike Ploog, the artist of Weird World, who did some marvelous layout and character design for Ralph Bakshi's disappointing animated film version of The Lord of the Rings. What sort of influence did The Lord of the Rings have on your own work?
Not a lot, because I'll tell you, to be honest, I've never read the book.
Oh, you haven't?
I tried. I'm one of these people, I do a lot of reading. I read The Hobbit. I take it back, I did read The Hobbit, but I couldn't read the rest. And, you know, I may be the only person in the world that hasn't read the Tolkien, but I find Tolkien very difficult to read. I'm a guy that likes to sit down and be able to read a book completely through without going back 3 chapters to find out who now I'm reading about. And he was a marvelous genius, but I've never read the books other than The Hobbit.
But you're one of the definitive Tolkien artists.
I know. Actually, I'll tell you, I'm doing some Tolkien work right now, and I keep going back to the books and looking them up, because I've got a great breakdown on Tolkien. It's a book that is a breakdown of Tolkien and what was going on and where it was going on, and it even tells you where it's happening within the book. And I go to the breakdown, and then I go to the book, and I read that section. And by the time, I don't know, by the time I'm ready to retire, I'll probably have read them all in bits and pieces.
Over in speculative fiction, Tolkien's influence has been, well, enormous. And to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Tolkien's birth, renowned anthologist Martin Greenberg commissioned 20 top authors of science fiction and fantasy to write stories in honor of J.R.R. Tolkien. One of my earthly operatives in control caught up to Marty at the WesterCon convention in Seattle.
How difficult was it to collect those stories? What was the reaction of the authors when you told them what you were doing?
Well, I think, first of all, I was able to offer a high word rate. So people sat up and took notice of that. And the parameters of the book, which were that they would need only be stories inspired by Tolkien, really allowed people to do what they wanted. We did not have use of his characters or settings. I mean, we couldn't use The Hobbit, or certainly everybody has been honoring Tolkien by rewriting him constantly, you know, since Lord of the Rings. This is an extension of that, but I think without being so heavy-handed about it.
After the King is a bit uneven, but Terry Pratchett's Troll Bridge is quite touching. Robert Silverberg's sublime story, A Long Night's Vigil at the Temple, earned a place in the year's best science fiction. And Charles de Lint's entry is simply magical.
When I write short stories, I don't often write them I just don't sit up and write a short story. What happens is I get asked by an editor for a theme anthology, and I like that idea. I like being given kind of, do something about this, whether it's, you know, magic cats or Shakespeare or a Tolkien type story. And I like that, to be able to stretch from there and see where I can go.
Well, I love the idea in The Conjure Man that this tree on a university campus could pluck stories off of the wind and preserve them for posterity. But how did The Lord of the Rings prompt you to write a contemporary story about storytelling?
Well, most of the things that I write nowadays are contemporary settings, and of course Tolkien isn't. But he did write one piece called Leaf by Niggle,